This video covers the Nematoda, or the roundworms. We've talked about several groups in this class that use the term worms. Worm simply means a vermiform, worm-shaped organism. So we've talked about flatworms, the segmented worms or annelids, but these are the roundworms. So here are the animals we've covered thus far. So we're staying in the Protostomia clade, but we're leaving the Lophotrochozoa and beginning to investigate the representatives of the ecdysozoan. Now, what ecdysozoa refers to is a synapomorphy for this group is they show ecdysis, which means a shedding. So they have some type of external cuticle or covering that as they grow, they have to shed that external structure and then grow and produce another external covering. So the first group that we're going to cover in this, as I mentioned, are the Nematoda, the roundworm. This is a very diverse group. 25,000 species have been named, but the estimates are that there could easily be 500,000 unnamed species. And this is because they're especially ecologically diverse. We have lots of free-living forms in almost all habitats, and they're parasites of almost all plants and animals that have ever been described. An early researcher, nematologist, said that, as a matter of fact, if we could somehow remove all of matter in the universe, that the Earth would still be visible simply by, if we left nothing but nematodes. We would see the outline of the planet because there are that many of them in soil. We would still see the outline of trees and plants because of the nematode parasites that they have, and the same thing for animals. So they're really super abundant as far as biomass. They're triple elastic, bilaterally symmetrical animals. They don't show a great deal of cephalization as far as a big brain, but they do have a concentration of nervous material on their anterior end, and there is a nerve ring that's associated with sensory structures there. They're not eucoelomates. We're dealing again with a pseudocoelomate group, so they have a body cavity, and it's actually a well-defined body cavity, but it's only lined by mesoderm on the outside and not the inside, not the endoderm. Their body is covered in a non-living, flexible, collagenous cuticle, and this is secreted by their epidermis, and their epidermis is syncytial. This is something we've seen in a lot of organisms, so all of the cells of this structure have merged together, and so it produces this very large kind of single cell with lots of nuclei. As I mentioned, being ecdysozoans, as they grow, and they usually go through several kind of juvenile phases where they are growing into the adult form, and as they pass through these juvenile phases to become an adult, they have to shed this cuticle or go through ecdysis, this shedding, molting process, and regrow a new collagenous cuticle. They have a very substantial pseudocele, so this fluid-filled internal cavity, and it is the primary support mechanism. So they use hydrostatic support. The cuticle also helps maintain hydrostatic pressure, so it resists movement of water in and out of the organism and provides a nice external structure. It's fairly flexible, but it is substantial. They do have substantial longitudinal muscles, but that's it. They're found in 4 bands that run the length of the body, and they have these muscular arms that extend to the dorsal and ventral nerve cord. So you can see that on the bottom right here. You see the cell body, that is the arm of the muscle that is reaching to make the connection to the nerve cord, but the contractile part of the muscle is next to the epidermis, and it's running the length of the body. So this is really different from most organisms in which you have more of the cells extending to the muscles to control contractions. Now we actually have extensions of the muscles that are extending to the nerves. So that's very unique. There is a nerve ring that surrounds the pharynx, and then this is connected to dorsal and ventral nerve cords that run the length of the body. And each of these have lateral sensory nerves that branch off of those and are connected in many cases to sensory papilla found in the head and the tail regions, and to a couple of very specific sensory structures. These structures are called amphids, so they're a pair of these chemosensory structures on the head in most free-living forms. They're actually quite reduced in parasitic forms, though. Here is a picture of one of these amphids, so it's basically an opening to the outside environment where there's a pore connected to these sensory structures. Now, parasitic forms have a similar structure called a phasmid. This is also a chemosensory structure, but it tends to be found in pairs and concentrated near the tail end of the parasitic forms. Because they only have longitudinal muscles, they really don't have very refined movements. They can move, but it's more of a thrashing movement where they are contorting their body left and right in very quick thrashing movements. The free-living forms eat a variety of prey. So living prey include bacteria, yeast, and other fungi, algae. Animal prey include other small animals like rotivores, small annelids and tardigrades, and other nematodes, because nematodes themselves are relatively small. Many of them are also saprozoic, which means they feed on dead organisms, so they're important in the decay process. Others are coprozoic, meaning that they feed on feces. And you can see from this figure that depending on their diet, they do have changes in their pharynx and their mouth parts modified for the different diets. So there are quite a few free-living forms, and they can be very important, particularly in, say, soil-like environments. But there are also lots and lots of parasites. And we're going to cover a lot of these parasites in more specific in the section on symbioses. This is just a picture of a very common plant parasite called the root knot nematode. They do have a complete digestive tract, but it's relatively simple with not a lot of organ specialization along the digestive system. They have a muscular pharynx. Some do have a stylet, a hard structure for piercing host tissues to help them feed. But then the muscular pharynx basically leads directly into a very simple intestine, straight intestine, that then leads into the anus. There are no circulatory or respiratory systems. Nutrients and waste move simply through the pseudocoel. Diffusion of gases occurs across the epithelium, and some don't even really rely on much gas exchange. They rely on anaerobic metabolism instead of aerobic metabolism, and so they don't really use as much oxygen as most organisms. One of the unique features about nematodes is they have a very unique excretory gland system, a series of excretory ducts that run the length of their body and release nitrogenous waste through these excretory pores. But they're unlike any other excretory structures seen in animals. Can't be classified as protonephridia or metanephridia. The cuticle also helps in osmoregulation by limiting the amount of water that can go in or out of the body. And as you won't be surprised, like all the animals we've covered this far, these are ectothermic animals. As far as reproduction goes, asexual reproduction is relatively rare, but there is parthenogenesis seen in some species. And sexual reproduction is not as varied as some of the previous animal groups we've talked about. They are all dioecious and show internal fertilization. Males are much smaller than females, and this is because female size is selected for because they can produce more eggs, and we'll talk about the substantial number of eggs that many females can produce. But these small males do have a structure called the copulatory spicule, which is a way that they can hold open the female gonopore and inject the sperm. And this is an adaptation because of the extremely high hydrostatic pressure associated with the pseudocoel, and so this helps to kind of keep this female reproductive structure open and make insemination possible. Another bizarre thing about the nematodes is their sperm lack flagella, and they are instead amoeboid. Once fertilization does take place, though, the zygotes are immediately released into the environment, so this fits oviparous pattern of development. And there are no larval forms in the traditional sense. The juvenile worms look just like small versions of the adults, so this fits direct development. Nematodes are protostomes, but they do show some major variations in their developmental patterns. They have isolethal eggs with holoblastic cleavage, but instead of spiral cleavage, they show a unique form of cleavage called rotational cleavage. Rotational cleavage is seen in nematodes, and it appears to have independently developed in mammals as well. And as in most protostomes, where the blastopore comes to the mouth, in some cases there isn't even clear formation of a blastopore, and there's a lot of variation in the ways that the mouth and the anus form in different roundworm lineages. Another interesting thing about the development in roundworms is they show eutyly, which means a species has a fixed number of somatic cells. And so there's very specific developmental patterns that produce cells, a specific number of cells that have very specific function in these very small worms. And as I mentioned, most do show direct development with larval forms, but they're not larval forms that are very different morphologically from the larval forms we talked about in the other organisms. They really are just juveniles, versions of the adult body form. And you can see that here in this soybean nematode, which has an egg, which produces these first juveniles, which are little worms that can continue the life cycle. But in each stage of the life cycle, we just have the basic worm shape. Some of the free-living species live only a few days, while some of the parasitic forms have been known to live for up to 15 years in their host. We've talked about the importance of the cuticle in many ways, and the cuticle provides some structural and chemical defense in parasitic forms. So it's important in the production of chemicals that battle some host defenses, and so it's led to this coevolutionary arms race between the parasite worms and their hosts. Free-living forms also show the potential for developmental dormancy, and adults can go into diapause as reactions to stressful conditions. So if, say, for example, the soils are drying, during the development of individuals, the larvae can actually pause their development, and adults can go into a diapause state, waiting for conditions to improve. Another way that these organisms can survive in their environment is they show behavioral plasticity. They have been shown to modify their behavior as environmental circumstances change. So as the chemical environment changes, they can quickly adjust to that, and they learn appropriate behaviors in specific chemical environments. In fact, there's been evidence that there's social learning. So as the environment changes, individuals of different species even can communicate how they best can deal with these new environmental situations. So individuals can watch other individuals and modify their behavior based on the behavior of these other individuals. And this is both within a species and even across nematode species in, say, a soil community. So let's talk about some of these symbiotic relationships that are so important. Again, almost all of these are parasitic relationships. One important plant parasite is the root knot nematode. And so eggs will be found in the soil. They develop into first stage juveniles that can infect plant roots. And then as they infect these plant roots, they attach to growing cells. As they attach to some of these cells, they turn them into what are called giant cells. And the giant cells are enlarged. They're induced to do so by the worms themselves, and they begin feeding on these cells. And this induces the plant also to grow these big nodules or galls. And this serves as an environment for the growing worm to live as it feeds off of the plant tissue. And then adult females can produce eggs that in some cases are parthenogenetic and can just grow into other juvenile individuals. And sometimes males are also involved for sexual reproduction. And here you see two examples of a plant that has been infected by root knot nematodes and one that's uninfected. And so you can see it does some substantial changes to the morphology and the functioning of the plant roots. In animals, one of the prominent parasitic forms is there are various species in the genus Ascaris. These are intestinal roundworms. The one that infects humans, it's about 25% infection rate in some parts of the southeastern United States, and about 1.2 billion people worldwide. This is because these worms are very proficient at reproduction. Females can lay 200,000 eggs per day. Now, how could you get this? Well, you get it by eating uncooked vegetables that come from contaminated soil. So it's important to wash and really cook your vegetables to kill off any potential Ascaris eggs. A little about the life cycle. If you do ingest an egg, it grows into a juvenile that will then burrow through your intestinal system. Once it does that, it gets into your circulatory system and hitches a ride through the heart until it gets to the capillary beds of your lungs. It then crawls through the alveoli, the little grape-like sacs in your lungs, where the capillary beds are. It munches its way through that, and then it migrates up your trachea to your throat, where the host then swallows, and it ends up putting them back in the digestive tract from where they started this entire trip. And at this point, that's when they mature into adults in the intestines. So this kind of joyride that the juveniles take before maturing takes about 2 months. So, what are the symptoms if you are infected with Ascaris? Well, sometimes these infections can be pretty massive, and you can develop some severe abdominal problems, including blockage, where the worms grow to the point where it completely fills up your intestines. Some individuals can actually have allergic reactions to the cuticle itself, and that can cause some problems. And occasionally, adult worms can wander. So it's almost like they missed that road trip they took as juveniles, and they'll crawl to different parts of the body out of the intestine. Sometimes they go south and can peek out of the anus. Sometimes they'll actually crawl up an individual's throat. And sometimes they'll actually, while passing through the throat, they'll pass through the eustachian tube into the middle ear. And again, sometimes these infections can be pretty dense, particularly in children, and especially boys. Another type of roundworm infection that you could get in the U.S. is hookworm. Hookworms are blood-sucking parasites that are endoparasites, and they feed off of blood in the intestines. And this can cause anemia in individuals that have big infections. So how do you get hookworms? Well, in this case, you don't even have to eat anything. These suckers, as you can see here with these big mouth parts in their muscular pharynx, they can actually just chew through your skin, get into the circulatory system, and then otherwise it's pretty much the same road trip that the Ascaris worms had. So that they make it go through the circulatory system to the lungs, then crawl through the trachea, and then end up into your intestines. Drachenia worms are also roundworms. They cause an illness called trichinosis. Found in a lot of mammals. The adults also live in the intestines, but in this case, juveniles migrate to muscle tissues all over the body of their host and take over muscle cells where they form these cyst-like structures where they're feeding off of these muscle cells. Now, you could get this by eating contaminated meat, pork mainly, and it's the pigs that would have the juveniles that are forming these cysts in their muscle cells. Humans just have the adults that live in the intestinal tract. So this is an example of a life cycle that involves multiple hosts. In this case, U.S. infections are relatively rare, and only about 12 are reported per year in the United States. Pinworms. Now we're going to go from rare to really common. Pinworms are the most common nematode parasite in the U.S. About 30% of children, about 16% of adults at any given time have pinworm infections. And again, the adult parasites live in the large intestines. They're living in the intestines. In this case, the females have this behavior where they migrate to the anus at night to lay eggs around the rim of the anus. Well, this, not surprisingly, causes irritation. And so if you're infected by these, there's a good chance that you're going to scratch that. And if you do scratch that, there's a good chance that you're going to spread it around. And so this is why this is so easy to spread around with bad hygiene, not washing your hands. And if you get some of these eggs, you spread them around. Especially kids are the worst at this. So, I mean, think about it. If a kid has a scratchy anus, they're going to scratch it and then wake up in the morning and give you a hug. And then suddenly you've got pinworms as well. Your book talks about how you do tests for pinworms. The test is very low tech. Basically what they can do is they'll bend you over and they'll take a piece of scotch tape, put it on your anus, pull that off, and then put the tape on a slide and look for eggs. And if one member of the family has it, again, they produce so many eggs, and it's so easy to spread these things around. They can easily be consumed. And so, if one person in the family has it, most of the individuals are going to get it in the family. And so taking some medicine to kill off these nematodes is fairly easy to do, and it's better just to get everybody on the same drugs at the same time. Last group of these parasites to talk about are the filarial worms. Filarial worms are different from the previous ones we've talked about that live in the intestinal tract. These live in the lymphatic system. And what they do is as they grow, they obstruct these lymphatic systems and the movement of lymph fluid. This is a particular problem in tropical regions where about 120 million people a year are infected. In this case, you don't get it by eating something or touching contaminated soil. There's an animal that gives it to you, and an animal that delivers an illness to you is called a vector. So the vectors for most filarial worms are mosquitoes and black flies. And so one of the filarial worms can give what's called elephantiasis. You get a mosquito that has the worms. It bites you. These juveniles enter your blood vessels. They make their way to the lymphatic tissue where they grow into adults, clogging these lymph nodes, leading to an increase in swelling and increase of connective tissue growth in these extremities, causing elephantiasis. So here's an example of an individual with elephantiasis. Another type of filarial worm illness is called river blindness, which is found in the Middle East and can be caused by a black fly vector. Closer to home, dogs, a large fraction of dogs, if they're not treated with heartworm preventatives, can get dog heartworms and get these nasty infections, which can be deadly in dogs, and mosquitoes in this case are vectors. In Africa, there's another eye illness called loasis, or African eyeworm, and in this case the vector is a deer fly. So as I mentioned, virtually all plant and animal species have known nematode parasites, and these endoparasites of roots can cause some major agricultural losses. Endoparasites of domestic animals can also cause major losses in agriculture. And of course, endoparasites of humans can cause major disease and in some cases death. And unfortunately, their studies have indicated that climate change may be increasing the spread of these parasitic forms from areas like the tropics as other areas begin to become subtropical, and the subtropics spread with the increased global warming. And then also the growth rate of some of these parasitic forms may be increasing due to warmer temperatures. But not all roundworms are parasites. A lot of them are free-living, and in fact, virtually all habitats have free-living species, and they can be super abundant where they're found. So topsoils can contain billions of individuals per acre. And in this environment, they play a critical role in cycling of carbon and therefore producing CO2 emissions. So this means warmer soils can mean greater CO2 emission. Now, when soils become too warm and too dry, then they can actually kill off roundworms. And these roundworms in these situations are also important for nutrient cycling. So it's a balancing act between keeping the roundworms at appropriate numbers and nutrient cycling without producing too much CO2 emissions versus killing them off and failing to have this nutrient cycling. Finally, just a quick mention that one famous roundworm, Caenorhabditis elegans, is what we call a model organism. So it was an organism that was decided upon early on in the 60s that, hey, let's just focus on this organism and let's learn everything we can about it and see how this can be used to inform us about other more complex organisms. And so early genetic and developmental studies have led to a lot of important discoveries about genetics and developmental biology in general. So C. elegans, we now have a complete sequence of its genome, and we have that for quite a few animals and plants now, but this was one of the first ones for which we were able to get a complete genome sequence. And this has led to us understanding the function of every single one of its genes. In fact, we know so much about its development that we know the developmental fate of every single somatic cell and can track what is going to happen to each cell during development. And remember, these organisms have eutyly, which means they have a set number of cells, and C. elegans has 959 individual cells. So in review, this is a large ecologically widespread group. They're triple blastic bilateral symmetry that do show cephalization, but not a lot of sensory structures. This is our first group that are ecdysozoans, which means that they have this external cuticle that they have to molt as they grow. They're pseudocoelomates, and the pseudocoel is very well developed and is important in hydrostatic support and also for circulation and movement of nutrients and waste products. They have well-developed longitudinal muscles, but that's it. So they have this thrashing movement. They have an anterior nerve ring around the pharynx with two primary nerve cords, dorsal and ventral. The sensory structures include sensory papilla, which are mechanosensory, and then the amphids and phasmids, which are chemosensory. And as I mentioned, their only locomotion really is thrashing movements because of the restriction of longitudinal muscles. And we talked about the importance of the free-living forms and the parasitic forms. Make sure you know the representatives of those that we talked about. They have a complete digestive tract with a mouth and an anus, but it's relatively simple without a lot of specialization. They do have a unique excretory gland system that's really quite different from the other excretory systems seen in other animals. Primarily has sexual reproduction. Individuals are dioecious. The species are dioecious, so individuals are either male or female, and they show internal fertilization. The sperm are really bizarre in the fact that they're amoeboid. They are technically protostomes, but they do have some pretty major changes in cleavage, so they show rotational cleavage instead of spiral, and other developmental patterns like really is not, in some cases, even the formation of a blastopore, and so the mouth and the anus form in different ways. They show direct development of young through adult-shaped larval forms, but they don't have aquatic larval forms that are very different as we saw in some of the earlier organisms. Typically have a relatively short lifespan in the free-living forms, but it can be longer in some of the parasitic forms. Cuticle is a substantial structure that provides some support, but also some chemical and structural defenses against the outside environment. Even for simple animals, they do show some behavioral plasticity and different behaviors as they react to different environmental cues, like chemical cues. And this information can be learned from individual to individual within the same nematode species and even across nematode species in a free-living community. So I talked about several examples of parasitic forms of both plants and animals, and I do want you to know those details, those representatives. And lastly, we did talk about the extensive distribution of these free-living and parasitic forms and how climate change may be affecting each of these in different ways.